so excited to introduce our first session and presenters today from opposite ends of the globe, but yet with the same living room and fireplace. Gretchen Cook Anderson, Assistant Vice President of Diversity Recruiting and Advising at IES Abroad, and Dr. Carla Lever, Research Fellow at the Nelson Mandela School of Public Governance and IES Abroad Cape Town professor, will sit down together today. They are discussing the history of protest in South Africa. Dr. Lever teaches the popular IES course, Power and Protest, Apartheid to Present, on our Cape Town Health, Culture, and Development program. And when asked to highlight the most important things learned in Dr. Lever's course, past students have not only noted a more concrete understanding of apartheid in South Africa and contemporary and ongoing protests, but also felt understanding the theatricality and the physicality behind protests fundamentally shape their understanding of Cape Town and their surroundings. Gretchen and Carla are joined today by Michaela Scott, a Villanova University student who studied at IES Cape Town in fall 2019. We're thrilled to have all of you here today and really looking forward to this discussion. Gretchen, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you so much, Francesca. I'm waiting for Francesca to get her own TV show because she's so good at this. But thank you for all you're doing to make all of this happen. So Carla, it is such a pleasure to talk to you again. Carla and I had a chance to kind of get together, so to speak, virtually last week to get to know each other a little better. And so that was lots of fun. And so I'm really looking forward to this conversation with you today. And as Francesca mentioned, it's really cool that we get to have the same backgrounds, even though the climates that we're in are significantly different. I am in the cold, the very cold in the Boston area. And of course, Carla is joining us from Cape Town. So I've got my scarf. I was letting everybody know I'm in full theme today for our fireside chat. I've got my little scarf. I've got my mint green tea next to me as well. So I am ready to go. But again, Carla, thanks so much for joining us. And I look forward to also talking to Michaela in a little while too. So I'm always amazed by our faculty, the diversity of thought and subject matter. Yours is a particular kind of special interest to me, Carla, not only from my professional work at IES Abroad, but also as a years-long aspiring activist for social justice. And I say aspiring activist because I feel like I'm always learning from others, even after 34 years of kind of being involved in social justice work. I was active as a college student in America's anti-apartheid movement in the 1980s and had the life-changing opportunity to meet the venerable Nelson Mandela in Tokyo in October 1990, just months after my own college graduation and months after his release from Robben Island. The photos I took with him are still among my most valued personal possessions. I know we'd all love to learn more about the course you teach, Power and Protest, Apartheid to Present. And I wish I could actually be a student again in your course there in Cape Town. I'd love to take your class myself. So I'm hoping to send one of my sons there while they're in college to take your course so I can learn through him, hopefully. So to get us started, Carla, do you mind giving us a brief synopsis of the course that perhaps we couldn't get from the online description, kind of your own personal synopsis?
Oh, tricky. I mean, I wrote the online descriptions for me, but it's lovely to be here. Thanks for having me. Great to see Michaela. And yes, let's give it a shot. I guess the course says it's about protests, and the course says it's a cross-reference history and politics, but it's really more than that. It uses protests as a framework really for understanding inequality in what is basically the most unequal country in the world, according to Gini coefficient. So we divide things up. Every 2 weeks, we go into a different block and we theme them. So we start with gender and education, service delivery, state security, we go into cultural resistance. And we really try and grapple with the idea that the roots of the inequalities we see now have been laid long before, and looking at ways that they were tackled then and dissent was raised then, and how change was forced, and how, again, these same issues are being tackled now, the different tactics. So it really weaves together a lot of things, and it really is looked at through the lens of performance, which I think is an interesting twist.
Wow. I really wish I was in Cape Town. So
What
what was the
usually look like
impetus?
that? That's great.
What was the impetus for developing this particular course? You know, had you taught anything similar prior to this, before premiering it with IES Abroad students?
I love the use of premiere there. It does sound very theatrical. Well, I guess my PhD, which I did at the University of Sydney, looks at performance in South Africa and the national identity. And a lot of that was in politics, and some of that was in protest. So while I was writing that thesis, I had the opportunity to lecture on a course there called Dangerous Performances, which is a great title, and really everyone sort of responds to that sort of title. And I found the students also responded to looking at, although it was a theatre course, looking at small p performances, theatricality in everyday life. And I realized what a great framework it was to really understand protest, which is inherently an embodied act of dissent, through a lens of performance. So that's where it came from. I think it gives us a really useful language, an unusual language to speak about what's happening when we see and experience protest.
Thank you. And when you were talking about the theatricality of kind of protest, can you dive a little bit deeper into that? Like, what is I was when I was looking at your course description, I noticed this verbiage, performance theory. Can you share a little bit more about what that is and how it plays into the course?
Sure. I think I use a very simple concept, not at all intimidating, but it's this lovely idea that performance isn't just the kind of things we think of, like theatre or dance, things that happen on a stage, capital P, stuff that we pay a ticket to entry. It's actually a spectrum. So from capital P all the way down to small p, everyday acts of life that we might not consider ourselves performing, but which we can analyze if we look at them as performative. Now that can be everything from, theatre all the way through to, say, for example, sport, or we could look at politics, but we can even get into the nitty gritty and look at gender presentation or things like that. Everything about us really is a performance, and you can go as deep into that as you want. Really, we just look at the two ends of the spectrum, everyday life, and we look at also protest theatre, I guess.
Interesting. Now, I was wondering too, it seems like this subject matter really sets itself up nicely for some really fascinating guest speakers or guest lecturers. Or are there any folks that you would tend to invite in to be part of the course so that students can hear different voices? And then also, are there any excursions that may be part of the course, either past or maybe even as you're thinking about for the future?
Absolutely. In fact, part of the battle I always have is I want students out the classroom. I want them using their own bodies to experience space, and also to go into spaces where maybe for the first time they feel uncomfortable in a space. I think too often, if we're middle class, if we're white, if we're many layers of privilege, we automatically feel comfortable in spaces. And it's important to realize that not every body has that same experience, and not every body can navigate space and culture in the same way. So the more we get out the classroom, the more we hear from other people, and the more we navigate interesting spaces and experiences, I think the better for this kind of course. We've done everything from hopping down the road, where we conveniently have an activist training organization with some great guest speakers, to going into informal settlements with social justice organizations to look with our own eyes at the lighting, at the toilet facilities, to really understand, not just read on paper why people are protesting, to looking at statues that have been defaced, not just reading about them. I think there's a very visceral experience of looking in spray painted bronze eyes that you can't capture sitting in a classroom. So speaking to people is important, but also being in places is important, and we do both.
Wow, thank you. Going back a little bit to the theatricality around protests that you talk about in the course, it reminds me of the U.S. Civil Rights Movement, and just to do a little bit of perhaps comparing, and songs, the songs of the movement, songs like "Ain't Gonna Let Nobody Turn Me Around," that was very popular during the U.S. Civil Rights Movement as a rallying cry. And they were both inspiration and rallying cry, of course. And what was the role of song in the anti-apartheid movement? And how do you underscore its importance during the course you teach, if you do? And do you have any examples of any of these kind of song within the anti-apartheid movement and then the current protest movement?
I think it's Abdullah Ibrahim who said that South Africa was the only revolution that happened in 4-part harmony. Now, as you've just explained, that's not true. Song is a perennial feature of protest around the world, especially in the African diaspora. But yes, it was a strong feature of our own movements. And I think there are many reasons why it's so popular. We can look at the idea of solidarity and a repertoire that binds community memory and holds spirit, builds spirit while holding memory. We can look at rhythm and the idea of the importance of a driving beat, an affect that's given to look intimidating or to look full of spirit. And we can look at harmony and the importance of everyone literally having their own part and bringing something to a whole movement. There's also the idea very practically of amplification, especially in our country, the idea that microphones are not always available. So even the person in the back feels they're participating. There are a lot of practical reasons why song has been a feature of both of our movements. But yes, we have a huge repertoire. They're not necessarily always rooted in a Christian tradition. Often they're rooted in a migrant labor tradition and often from other countries in Southern Africa. So you can have a song about working on the mines in Zimbabwe, still sung today in South Africa. There's a flexibility around shared oppression, which I think is also quite beautiful, a solidarity that's Pan-African. Yes, but there's a good example I can think of. I think Michaela might have been in this class where we went to Chisimani. Were you there, Michaela, when Ben Turek spoke? Can't remember. Yes, you were. Yeah. So anti-apartheid activist, I think he was in his 90s. He was speaking, as it turns out, down the road from us. We were so lucky. We went to hear him talk about his experience of activism. In many cases, very controversial activism at the time. He talked about laying a pipe bomb. It was fascinating to hear him speak. And this man said he was there, in fact, an integral part of, in 1955, when the Freedom Charter was passed. This is a foundational text to our anti-apartheid movements that really laid the groundwork for our Bill of Rights now. Now, he spoke about the whole situation where everyone had gathered and they were meticulously going through clause after clause, when all of a sudden on the second day, police surrounded the venue. And they came in and they were heavily armed. Some were on horseback, there were tanks, and they declared the meeting over. Chaos erupted, and everyone was absolutely outraged that this meeting had been cut short. Everyone jumped up, and he said in that moment, he thought there would be a massacre. He was minutes away from it. But the chairperson was very smart. I think it was the chair. He began singing a song, and he chose a song called Senzani Na, which means, what have we done? And it's, I think, actually, what have we done to be treated this way is a longer title. But yes, what have we done? It's very slow. It's very reflective. There's nothing spirited about it. It's very reflective. And he chose it deliberately because it calmed everyone. It focused everyone. It made everyone realize the common purpose and the battle and the war, right? And in that moment, people sat down and there was quiet. And he chose that moment to say, everyone in favor of passing the entire bill, say A. The room erupted. And before the police could stop it, the whole Freedom Charter was passed. The power of song.
Wow. Oh, that was beautiful. Thank you.
Better when he said it.
What a beautiful example, that you just shared with us about the power of song. Thank you. I saw this term in your course description that I was curious about. It was unfamiliar. Not that I know everything about the anti-apartheid movement or protest in South Africa, but it was intriguing. And so I thought I would ask you about it because I figured others would also be just as curious. What is the Toi Toi method? And I may be mispronouncing it, but the Toi Toi method of South African protests that you've mentioned in the description.
Yes, excellent question. I made the terrible error in class, possibly with Michaela, of trying to demonstrate this. I will never do it again. So I will, yes, she's nodding, never again. I will simply tell you the toy method of it's a dance. It's a movement, a full body, often with singing. And it involves raised knees, marching with raised knees and a punch. You see, I'm already doing it. Something about the body, it makes you want to get moving. Raise the pumping fist, the raised knees. And it enables large groups of people to, again, have a choreography, to bind them together. They're still able to move forward in rank, but it looks incredibly intimidating to have these sort of raised fists, high-kneed protesters coming towards you. At the same time, I want to say this can be used in anger and frustration. It can also be used in jubilation. Context is everything. It's an incredibly adaptable tactic. And really beautiful to bind people together in a simple little choreography of dissent.
Wow. So it's toy. Is that how it's? Toy. Okay. So I'll know in the future if I come across it again, I'm going to have that down. So maybe I can impress other folks from South Africa by knowing exactly how to say it. Toy. Thank you very much for that. Really interesting. I'm glad I asked. So I'm gonna ask some questions, a couple of questions around kind of comparing U.S. civil rights movement and South African movements, social justice movements. What's the most significant difference between protest against apartheid, for example, and the protests in the U.S. civil rights movement? Are there any differences that have stood out to you as you've perhaps studied both over the years?
I mean, I've definitely studied more on our own, but I'm no expert. But I think it is important to draw a distinction between a civil rights movement and a liberation or independence movement. It's also, I mean, it's obviously the case there are so many similarities. And I was saying to you, egregious similarities, and it's no coincidence that there are. The white supremacy playbook goes back centuries. So many similarities, but it's also important not to map simplistically. Our countries are different for all their similarities and connections. Our movements are different for all their similarities and connections. I think, so there's a difference between a liberation movement and a civil rights movement. I'm afraid I'm going to be awful and say another similarity, and that a lot of people think these are historically discrete moments that are over with a change of legislation. And in both cases, I think we need to consider that these struggles continue today. They're not simple closed book historical events. I haven't really given you the differences you were looking for, have I?
But you know what? But nevertheless, a fascinating answer. So I really appreciate that, because I too would probably agree that there are more similarities than there are differences, and that the points in time are not the only thing that we should all be discussing and thinking about and delving into, but the continuum. So thank you so much for that. When you think about your time in the classroom with IES Abroad students, what are you most surprised that students know or don't know about South African protest and protest movements?
Actually, I'm surprised they know anything. I'm really endlessly impressed every time that students come with a variety of information they've really picked up. A lot of it, may I say, through the old Trevor Noah lens, which I've noticed has come up quite a bit. It really speaks to the importance of soft power, I guess. Not to be scorned, because that's where a lot of people have got some really important facts from. So they've come with a lot, and I'm not surprised that there are a few historical gaps. That's to be expected. But what really surprises me are some of the philosophical gaps. I find them fascinating. So, for instance, a lot of students slip automatically into speaking about people of color as African American, no matter where. And I think that's a really interesting invitation to look at our discomfort with racial terms, how they've been used in the past, the power dynamic in naming, which is an invitation that I think we should take up and do take up. But it's an interesting slip. What else have I found? Oh, I found students also struggle a little bit with binaries they might have come with, cultural sensibilities of good or bad, And it's quite nice to have a simple idea of a liberation movement. But when you get a little more complicated on nonviolent resistance and militant resistance, when you look at our country's connection to a lot of our anti-apartheid movement was heavily aligned with communist movements around the world, and still is in many cases. And I think there's a discomfort around that simple narrative that maybe they've come with, that things can be many things and be held together. So I'm interested in what students come with. I'm always impressed that they come with open minds to receive difference.
Wow, thank you, thank you. I'm going to switch gears ever so slightly to current events, or a degree, some current events, and the tie-in to lessons in your course. So I saw news reports a few years ago, and I'm sure many of us remember these, about the Reclaim the City activism and the related concept of fallism in South Africa that may have had some influence on activists in 2020, as a matter of fact, who demanded statues be removed in cities in the UK and France and in the United States. What are these concepts? You know, can you tell us a little bit about the Reclaim the City period and the movement, as well as fallism, and what kind of changes has fallism brought about there in South Africa?
So while those two concepts are actually in some ways unrelated movements with their own protest history, of course, it is all related to the terrible levels of inequality that we still face in South Africa, even post-apartheid. So I'll start with fallism, which was in 2015, and I think really has sparked, gathered interest around the world. You've spoken about statues. In 2015, we had the first statue defaced in Cape Town, just down the road from IES. And within a few weeks, I think about 15 statues around the country were similarly spray painted, broken down, toppled. Of course, this is something you experienced yourself in the US and Virginia, and it's spread all around the country. So I'm really interested in that decolonial idea that was sparked initially with us, that really spread through to Oxford. Rhodes in Oxford was toppled as well. It seemed to be a tactic that caught on in a way that was really, really powerful. In fact, many people criticized it at the time, saying it's a chaotic thing to do. It's clearly anti-debate. It's what is happening. But I think that there is nothing more eloquent than what happened. It's not anti-debate. It was very clear what the sentiment was, and it sparked a great deal of debate that's still ongoing around the world.
Wow. Thank you so much.
Also fallism.
Yeah.
Let me just speak of that separately, or
Reclaim the City.
Mm-hmm. So, yes, Reclaim the City, forgive me. Reclaim the City is a movement of activism that was taken up because of the fact that since apartheid, 2.5 decades ago, not one site of affordable housing or social housing has been built in our cities, which means that with a result, economic pressure and structural apartheid systems that haven't fully been dismantled, we still have apartheid cities by default. We may not have the laws, but the people who can afford to live in the city are still white. And the people who can't, but who must work in the city to support the things that go on, must live outside the city. So Reclaim the City is a powerful movement of activists that use a range of tactics, including occupation of public land and buildings, which is controversial and very powerful. And they've lobbied government and made significant victories, which is quite inspiring.
Thank you so much. And I appreciate you for making the distinction between the two. Thank you. In your view, what's emerging as the next possible catalyst for protest in South Africa?
It's always service delivery. It's always the fact that some people will get on the phone immediately if their rubbish hasn't been collected on the day it said, and they will have that rectified, and other people will wait months. That some people have running water and bathrooms in their own house, and others have to walk 1 kilometer from their front door to go to shared bathrooms where they're unsafe. Service delivery is endlessly an issue. Housing, as I've spoken about, structural transformation, meaningful transformation, not just our legislation, but our lived realities. So that includes our cities, what they look like, it includes who's in power, it includes what our universities look like and what they teach. But increasingly after 2020, health services, health delivery, we're seeing a great deal of inequality with the vaccine. And I think that's going to be a great problem on our continent, particularly.
Thank you very much. So speaking of 2020, you were referring to 2020 in your the year, I don't even want to get into it, but 2020, I tell you. But how did that year, when you think about, it, how did that year that we just emerged from, how might it change the way you might teach this course to IES Abroad students once they return to the classroom? How do you, what kind of impact will it have on the content and maybe even your approach?
Great question. We've had some time to think about it, haven't we, Gretchen? We have, yes. I think my course has always been designed as an embodied experience. I want people, as I said, to be out the classroom, experiencing things. And sometimes we've been a little constrained by the fact that we have to meet in person. And I think there's a freedom in saying, we'll meet online, but I want you to self-tour. So setting walking tours that can be done on your own will be a great way to keep socially distanced, but actually get more out of classroom time. So I think there's possibilities there. There's also possibilities in that people are more open to virtual discussion. I'm really hoping to get 4 lists in conversation with Black Lives Matter activists. I'm hoping to speak to other Global South programs, but let's say protests in Chile. There's a center there that does have a whole stream on protest. It'd be great to tap into that. People are open to that. But above all, I think this course tries to ask people to think about the importance of liveness, the importance of being in a space and the body and the meaning of sharing a crowd and the feeling you get from that. And that's something I don't think we will ever take for granted anymore. We've missed it. It's something we've all viscerally missed and can think of the meaning and the value of in ways that we couldn't in 2019. So I actually think teaching this course again will be quite a powerful experience because students will get how important togetherness and liveness is.
Thank you. Thank you. Carla, I'm telling you, I got to figure out how to take this course. I'm telling you, I don't know. I got to figure out how to enroll. I am loving every word you are saying. So, when I think about the folks who are on with us today, we have representatives from, schools around the United States who have joined us to learn about your course and your approach to teaching. But how can they, as educators, administrators alike, who are kind of watching our conversation, listening in on our conversation, how can they support students in protest as a form of engaged citizenship? And I know that these are questions that a lot of our folks have on their minds. Faculty around the country, administrators around the country. These are things that people are thinking about. Many of us are acting on in ways that we find to be both appropriate and possible, in our realms. But do you have any thoughts on that you could share?
I think it's such an interesting word when you say support. There is a boundary that we have to keep. And our students come from all different political backgrounds, and having them hold space for their own views and what they do outside the classroom with their political views, that obviously is an important gap. But what I think our role as educators is twofold. One is to instill critical thinking around what we do and how we engage with what people do in a way that's open, keeps dialogue going, and sees critical, not in terms of criticism and tearing people down, but really engaging critically with issues, which is so important. And I think we are seeing the loss of this kind of critical discourse that we can hold, an openness to different things that we might not agree with, but we need to think about regardless. And the second thing that I think is a fundamental role of educators is we have young students who are experiencing the world out of their high school for the first time, and they are experiencing the world full on. These are not small things that are happening at the moment. And to be very aware, I think we are all so aware as educators that our students are going through a lot, as much as we are, they are. And to be gentle with them, to watch out for them in ways that within the bounds of our relationship, we can hold space for them, whatever they're experiencing, and create that atmosphere where they can come to us and discuss, feel safe doing that. It's an interesting question, but I think it's something we should all think about as educators, and I know all of us are.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that. And then my last question for you, Carla, before we bring Michaela into this conversation. We haven't forgotten about you, Michaela, I promise. What do you hope that students will gain from taking your course? When you think about, at the end of the day, the course is over. What do you really hope that they take away with it? What's, the top one or two things that you really hope they walk away having learned?
I don't think the most important thing for me is the history of South Africa. I think the most important thing for me is understanding structural systems and our own complicity in them, and the way that we benefit in ways that we don't necessarily see, but that when we look at how someone else is reacting to something, maybe that doesn't affect us, we try and understand the way that might be a language of power that, or speaking to power that works for them, even though it may not work for us. So an openness to understanding that people are coming from structurally very different places to us, and trying to imagine navigating a system in shoes that are not our own. That's what Study Abroad does. And I think the course hopefully helps furnish people with the tools for understanding structural, sort of systemic inequality, and navigating that in different ways. Not sure if that makes sense.
Thank you. Well, I have to say, even before we bring Michaela in, I feel like I've gone through a mini course today myself. So I just, I have literally learned new things today. So thank you, Carla. I can only imagine what your students learn with you over the course of an entire semester. Oh, the meatiness of it.
More from them. I really do. When you get in a room and you talk about these things, new things come up every time. And I'm certainly not the keeper of knowledge. I'm just the facilitator for everyone learning from each other. It's great. It's a great space.
Oh, I can imagine. Well, thank you, Miss Michaela. I know you were thinking, did they forget I'm here? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. But I wanted to just sort of transition to you. And I think, Francesca introduced you for the most part, but just to kind of remind everybody that you're a senior at Villanova. You're based right now, at least outside the Baltimore area, but you're headed back to school, I think you said, very soon, back to campus. And of course, we wish you well in the spring semester. So I wanted to ask you, what's the most significant thing? Carla was letting us know the most significant things that she hopes students come away with. So in turning that on you as an alum of her course, what was the most significant thing that you learned from her course?
That is such a loaded question, because I feel like Carla as we experienced today, like every single class, I feel like is just loaded with so many different things that I'm still being reminded of, a year later. So much, to put it simply. But I think when I was thinking about the answer to that, it's taught me how to find my place within a lot of these different movements and demonstrations, and whether that's, complicit in some senses, or, my position as an ally. It's allowed me to kind of zoom out of a lot of the things going on today and see where I lie, where I can insert myself, respectfully, and give me a level of confidence doing so. I could go on about the course, but I think if I had to put it in a sentence, that's pretty much where I would be.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Now, so I'm hoping that this next question is not too redundant, but feel free to stretch yourself as much, more if you'd like. So is there anything that you learned from the course that you feel that you could really practically apply in some way in the future, even when you think of your career aspirations?
Yeah. Well, as a direct result of my experience in Cape Town, I came home and decided to add an Africana Studies minor to my education at Villanova. Of course, as a result of Carla's class, but the experience in general, I realized how important everything was that I was learning. But as we were saying, the incredible similarities that exist. So right away, I knew that I wanted to continue studying these types of things. But I think as I kind of alluded to, becoming an ally like gained a whole new definition studying in Cape Town, and coming home I've found ways to actively practice that. As we were talking a little bit about before this, I jumped into a documentary learning how to become an ally for Indigenous women. I have actively participated in a protest or two since I've been home, which I think as a direct result of Carla's class, she, took in the best way. She took us to one, like if we wanted to, and I gained such a level of comfortability with that. So I mean, the results of that course will be, throughout my entire life.
Wow. Impact, right? I think that's what all faculty are after in the work that they do with students, right? So thank you, Michaela, for, really personalizing that. And then my last question for you, Michaela, can you tell us and I probably already know some of what you're going to say, but just because of what you've already kind of talked about a little bit with regard to Carla, can you tell us what you thought of Carla's teaching and her approach to power and protest?
Oh gosh. I think her class was probably different than any class I have ever experienced. And for the reason that she explained as well, it is the definition of experiential learning. I mean, the way the course is designed included so much of getting out and doing things, like you said, occupying space ourselves, taking a walking tour of the city and talking to speakers that I would never have the chance to do, walking to University of Cape Town and speaking to a current student. All of these things at least in my educational experience, have never really gotten the chance to do. Really experience and actively learn, I think, was the most important aspect.
Wow. Well, thank you so much. And I have to say too, I'm very impressed with you too, Michaela. Thank you for joining us today, number one, taking time out of a college student schedule to be with us. I think that really is probably a testament to your impression of the course and of your instructor. So, the fact that you were willing to kind of come and join us today. And I think we'll be keeping an eye on you in the future, Michaela. I'm thinking that there's some really big things ahead for you. So, as an IES alum, we're already proud of you, but I know that pride is going to grow over the years to come. So thank you so much for joining us. And now what we'd like to do is we really want to open up our conversation to some of the, to any of the folks who are with us today. If you have questions, I believe some people may have popped questions into the chat. You can either pop them into the chat, and I think Virginia, my colleague Virginia Gabby, is going to moderate our kind of collective Q&A, if you will. But I just personally want to thank both you, Carla, and Michaela for joining us today. It has been really cool talking to both of you. And like I said, I'm figuring out a way to take this class. I got to figure it out. I don't know what it takes as a staff member to but I would love to be part of that course and all of the rich conversation and inspiration that must come from it. So thank you so much. And I am going to turn the floor over, not really, but the space, the event over to Virginia Gabby. Thank you so much, Virginia, for moderating the rest of the conversation. But thank you, ladies.
We have our first question from Beth.
Yes, and I am right with Gretchen. I am taking this class. It's really nice to meet you, Carla. I also work for IES. I'm based in Massachusetts, and I work with college relations. Um, I'm just so excited about this. Like Gretchen, I was an anti-apartheid activist in college when back in the mid 1980s. And in fact, Bishop Tutu came to our school and I got to hear him speak, and it was just wonderful. My senior thesis, I really focused on Gandhian techniques of nonviolence, and my senior thesis was about how we can or cannot effectively apply Gandhian techniques to protest in the United States. I was just wondering if in your class, if you discuss Gandhi and if you have any thoughts on how his teachings may or may not translate to your country.
Absolutely. Well, it's so good to meet you, and thanks for your comments. What a great connection there, because of course, we spent a great deal of time in South Africa, and really was fundamental in a lot of the organizing and the structures that happened here. In fact, Michaela, I have a feeling that you spoke, was it Gandhi's great-granddaughter? Was that one? You tell the story.
Yeah, part of the course we took a trip to meet Gandhi's, I want to say it was her granddaughter. I can't remember exactly, but we got to meet her and talk to her, hear about her experiences. There was a bit of a museum. They kind of gave us a history of Gandhi's involvement, and yeah, I mean, incredible that we got to meet her, but we did have a bit of a taste of that.
I thought so. And there's also a real curveball, as it turns out, with Gandhi, isn't there, Michaela? Where one of the statues that was toppled after Rhodes was Gandhi. Gandhi is a controversial figure in South Africa, as fundamental as he was, because as it turns out, he also was a complicated figure with race, not always as anti-racist as you might think he was. So he's a controversial figure, and I think that's a beautiful moment for bringing in nuance again, as unfortunately, so is Mandela. Nelson Mandela is also a very complicated figure now, 2.5 decades into democracy, with a young crowd who don't feel as positive about him. And I think that's the nature of all great figures as they go through phases where people reassess legacies. It's a real learning opportunity. But yes, he was fundamental here, and come down. You can add to the course. Come and meet the granddaughter.
All right, our next question. Carla, do you teach any other courses with IES Abroad?
Theoretically, I do, but in practice, it hasn't run yet. So there is a co-course to this. It is called The Literature of Change, and it looks at everything from activist theatre to journalism to memoir and novels, protest literature in all genres. But we mostly have health students coming to Cape Town. I think that perhaps needs to change. We target the health students. So a lot of them are not open to literature. I'm hoping that changes because I can't wait to whip that one out. It's going to be a great course.
Awesome. All right. Which 2-week course module or project are you most excited to cover with students each semester?
Michaela, what was I most excited by? Because I get excited by all of it.
I was just gonna say, I feel like each week was the same level of excitement. Gosh, I don't know. Service delivery at the end was really interesting. I mean, you had plans for us to go visit things, so maybe that one.
I don't know. You know what I'm thinking? I really liked us going to the Occupy University in Sissy Gould House. I think that's what I'm most excited by. So sum it up very quickly. IES is in a particular suburb in a Cape Town. It's quite a privileged suburb, and maybe 1.5 kilometers down the road. Michaela, what's that in miles?
Oh, I don't know.
I can't translate. I thought you could help me here, having done both. Maybe 1 mile, let's go with 1 mile. Down the road, there is an old what is it, a nurse's accommodation unit, and it's quite, no, it was the old hospital in a place called Woodstock. Now that's lain empty for about 10 years. It's public land, and it's been earmarked for social housing, and that has never transpired. Reclaim the City have jumped in, and there are almost 1,000 people now occupying that building. Community gardening, beautiful supportive structures, but of course in direct conflict with the area and the people in the area who feel uncomfortable with this radical occupation in their backyards. So what we do, Michaela and I went with the other students and we visited, and they run an Occupy University where we sit down and they teach us. They teach us about how they run the house, the house structure, the community structure, how everyone supports everyone else. And I love that take on where the seat of learning lies. It's one of the reasons I like leaving university spaces, because I don't think they're always where the most critical learning can happen.
Awesome. All right. Another question for you, Carla. What makes a successful protest, and how do you even define if a protest is a success?
What a great question. I like that. Now, an example I can think of here that sort of comes out of left field of what you think is successful. I think it was Michaela's cohort where we went to the zombie protest. Was that with you? Yes, it was. I get confused. We do the same thing time after time. The zombie protest was also Reclaim the City. So it's on spatial apartheid, it's on public housing. And these occupied houses dressed up, they got all their kids together. In fact, the Yes Men, who are an American organization, perhaps you know them, satirical. They often take over news broadcasts and pretend to be the CEO of an oil company, or they dupe the news. They flew out and they worked with the activists. Everyone dressed up as zombies. It was very high-spirited, and there was a big march through to the civic center in town, placards, and they were all the pictures of the current city administration. The idea, with a big coffin brought in, and the house leader, Uncle Bevel, he comes out of the coffin. It's all very, very dramatic. The idea is bringing back from the dead the apartheid policies, that the leaders of today are really just the decayed leaders of yesterday in a new form. These policies stink. The idea is a very clear metaphor. But when the students came with me, it was a lot of fun. There were children involved. It didn't feel very impactful. It felt like a lot of people playing around and having fun, but no one knew what it was about. They didn't know if it was a joke. No politicians came out to receive the memo. It felt like it might have fallen flat. But then I asked students, well, let's think about how this might be successful in ways that are not immediately apparent. What are the metrics of success? And we realized that it's so catchy. The images are so strong. The analogy is so strong. It doesn't matter how many people were there. It doesn't matter how many people knew about it in the moment. Because if there's one thing that never dies, it's images on the internet. That's the real zombie graveyard, right? And when you Google JP Steenkamp and the people who are in power now, and you hit search, out comes all these people dressed up as him and as a zombie, and immediately people are intrigued and they want to know. So the immediate impact may be small, but the longevity of that impact and the stain on their policy, I think, had a huge impact that wasn't immediately apparent. Basically, what we did is we tried to think about what are the metrics of success? Does it always look like one thing? Might there be ways of being successful that come later or in other ways? Michaela, do you have anything to add to that?
Just that it was, like you said, in the moment, it didn't, all make sense to everybody there. I mean, at least us students, but it seemed as though the crowd there as well, like nobody was really sure when this was going to happen or, anything like that. But I do remember, I think you pulled up the articles of the next day of things that had been posted about it. And yeah, everything, like you said, it seemed, different the next day looking at it through a different lens. So yeah.
And of course, with the people who were there and the kids and getting them involved in a fun way in protest, the legacy of that, the idea that activism doesn't have to look like one thing, and it can be binding for a community. It can be fun. It can be many things that might not be it really creates a generational lead-in that I think is just as important in movement building as an individual protest. We had fun, certainly.
Great. One more question. Is there a conflict between student participation in protest demonstrations and health, safety, and security concerns?
Absolutely. I get read, dare I say, I get read the riot act every semester, and quite rightly so. The fact that we attended this protest was very hard to clear, and it was very specific in that it was one that I knew was family friendly, and children as young as 2 were going along. No, I can't and would never encourage students to go to protests themselves. I encourage them to experience inequality, but that's different. So yes, it's a very fine line, and we have had students get, before I taught the course, in fact, get so excited that they want to participate, and that can be dangerous. We have to understand when we are there in an anthropological role and when we're there as a student, and that we're often there to observe and think and listen. And there's a difference between an active participant and a careful scholar.
Great, thank you. We have about 5 more minutes if anyone else would like to ask one more question. We do have a comment I can read real quick. Thank you to Carla for sharing. I also really want to take this course now, and I'm inspired to see how we can truly embed more social justice coursework in all our programs.
Oh, that's great. Give us all the vaccine, buy a ticket, come on down.
Awesome. All right, well, if there's no more questions, then I will hand it back to Francesca.
Great. Thank you so much. Gretchen, Carla, Michaela, that was phenomenal. That was so interesting and just a lot of food for thought for all of us. And yeah, so we're so happy you could join us today. And I hope all of you enjoyed that conversation.